Well, on Monday, you were treated, I hope treated, to a monologue of mine watched online by tens of thousands, which lamented our media's obsession with American politics. I predicted that today BBC and Sky News would be treating the anniversary of violent protests at the Capitol building as the most pressing existential threat faced by Western democracy in modern times, or something like that. Sure enough, it's been wall to wall, including full coverage of a speech by Joe Biden in which he essentially blamed Donald Trump for the fatal events in Washington on January the 6th last year. Well, it would be churlish to ignore the event, hypocritical to dedicate the whole show to it. So, in a spirit of compromise, we'll offer you a snapshot. And we'll do it through the lens of the former White House press secretary, who I'm delighted to say joins us now, Sean Spicer. Sean Spicer, thanks so much for your time. Do appreciate it. I'm just looking at some remarks, which I'm sure you've got some thoughts on, from Kamala Harris, the Vice President, who likened the events on this day last year in Washington to Pearl Harbor.
And 9/11. And I think that, look, this was an opportunity for the president and the vice president to finally talk about those things, those opportunity to talk about unity, something that they talked about multiple times during the inauguration. And instead, they made it into a very partisan speech that was very mean and over the top. I was very taken back by the tone and tenor of the speech, by the attempt to blame everybody who didn't agree with what happened in the last election. And to frankly, to push a very partisan policy agenda, that is to falsely claim to the American people that their right to vote is under attack, which it is not. And so they are now using this as an opportunity to push left-wing policies, which is equally deplorable.
Sure, nobody wants to endorse what happened on January the 6th last year, do they? As you say, there's a bit of calibration to be done as to how far you go in criticising individuals, particularly in positions of leadership. Just tell me what you made on the day, as it unfolded in real time. What did you make of it?
So both as an American and as somebody who spent probably well over, I don't, off the top of my head, 15 years on Capitol Hill, maybe more. I was very taken back by that day. I thought it was despicable. It really put a knot in my stomach to think that Americans were hurting law enforcement, that were entering a federal building, one that stands as a beacon of our democracy, not just to our country, but to the world. So, I've been to countless Trump rallies. These were not people that I recognized in terms of supporters and people that I believe are part of the conservative movement. But it definitely was a stain on the movement, on our democracy. That being said, to make it, to equivalize it with 9/11, make it equivalent to Pearl Harbor, it minimizes the impact of both of those days in our nation's history. And I think, again, to use them as an opportunity to push a very left-wing partisan agenda is sort of unsettling to me. So I think that what's happened is we've taken a bad event and used it for political gain on the left, and that's unfortunate. They've also taken out of context. I was listening to Kamala Harris talk about the violence and the destruction, and I was thinking, well, where were you during the BLM riots? Where were you when all of the destruction was happening throughout our country? People were getting hurt, harassed, hit. Property was being destroyed and vandalized. Small businesses were being ransacked. A police officer named David Dorn was killed. And yet there was nothing that was said at the time. And so it's amazing. I've said this all along. Violence is always wrong. I've been very clear about it from day one. I'll call it out on the left. I'll call it out on the right. But it is amazing to me that the left only calls out violence when it is against something that they're against, i.e. a conservative or the conservative movement. But when it's in pursuit of a greater left-wing goal, nothing stands in their way. They forget that Chuck Schumer talked about people going after Justice Gorsuch, Congresswoman Maxine Waters of California talking about going after Trump people and getting in their faces. They have no problem calling for violence when it's in the direction that they want it to.
Sean, I'm sometimes wary of drawing too many parallels across a span of water that's about 5,000 miles in length. Nonetheless, there is some read across. You mentioned those Antifa protests. You mentioned a reluctance of law enforcement to prosecute some of the individuals involved in those violent protests. We've discussed on this programme, on this news channel, some of the efforts to effectively defund the police. It sounds potty to us on this side of the Atlantic, but actually there are activists in this country who think it's a pretty good idea.
Well, the funny thing about this is that in our own country, you're seeing a reversal where these cities that were talked about defunding the police are now requesting more police officers. They're revising their budgets. I think it's one of those things that in theory sounds good as a leftist until you realize how, what a spike in crime it's resulted in, how many additional businesses have been destroyed, how many people have been hurt, how many people have been assaulted. And you have the brand new mayor of New York as one of his first acts calling 911 to report a crime. I mean, not that, he's been on the forefront of this effort, but it just tells you how bad it's been when the first act of the new mayor of New York is to report a crime in progress right in front of him.
Yeah, that is something, isn't it? Sean Spicer, let's go back to where we began on January the 6th. To what extent do you accept that the President Trump, to some degree, shoulders blame for incitement?
Well, look, I think that you can go back in any instance. As I mentioned, Chuck Schumer talked about going and getting in Gorsuch's face, the Supreme Court justice. Maxine Waters talked about getting in front of Trump officials. And so you can always go back and say, did someone take your words out of context? And I think we have a history in the United States of talking about fighting for your rights and making your voice heard and letting Congress know what you think. And so the moment that someone crosses the line, you can look back and point to somebody and say, well, you're the one who told them to go do that. So I think it's easy to go back and do that. But we also have to take personal responsibility for our actions. I know that entering a building, whether it's a federal building or a private building, through a broken window is never acceptable. And so I think that for the folks that went, and we're talking about the timeline, right? President Trump spoke until well after 1 p.m. The breach of the Capitol occurred at 12:53, meaning the people who were breaching the Capitol were a mile away while the president of the United States was still talking. So it wasn't like they were taking direction from him to go do something. It was, it would have taken just to walk the distance between where his speech was and the Capitol. If you're a good walker, is 20 minutes. So the timeline doesn't match up. That being said, can you look back on any individual and say, hey, could you have, used your words differently and told them to be more specific about how to protest? Sure. So I think that there are moments when we can look back in history and say, could you have done it better? And I don't think that there's anybody that says, could we have made it clear? Could the president have gotten up earlier? Could he used his words better? But I would argue that you could almost do that in any situation. So would I have liked his words to be different? Sure. I wasn't happy with what I saw in the Capitol. I think he could have gotten out earlier on that day. But it's also, hindsight is 20/20, as they say. And I think it's interesting that we're forgetting about the context. One thing that's fascinating to me, and I brought this up for 2 nights on the show, after the Barack Obama second election, 13% of the American people did not believe he was legitimately elected. After Trump was elected 4 years later, that number skyrocketed to 45%. That number actually went down to 29% after Joe Biden's election. So it was the folks on the left, according to a brand new Washington Post poll, that started this idea of delegitimizing a presidency and election and undermining the integrity of the system. It was the left who created this narrative in 2016, and it's actually subsided since then. So for all of these folks in the media in the U.S. who love to talk about the right and the Trump folks who are doing this, it was them and their folks on the left that actually, birthed this idea and gave it merit, and then didn't do anything to stop it in 2016.
Yeah. Sean Spicer, very briefly, I've got to ask you about the president's future, whether he will stand for a re-election. And I wonder if I can frame the question in this context, that whether what you're describing, this kind of weaponization of what happened a year ago to discredit the former president, might be there to discredit him in such a way that it makes it impossible or more difficult for him to run again.
I think that that's an extremely valid analysis, because there's no other explanation. All of these folks, we had one of our prominent news anchors the other day question whether the party could survive Trump. And I'm like, I don't understand that. If people vote for him and he becomes the nominee and he wins, then therefore, if people vote, if the grassroots voters and then ultimately the American people elect him, then that is democracy. And so I do believe that you have a huge amount of resistance among the establishment media and the establishment institutions in the United States that are very concerned about him running for a second term. My personal view is at this moment, I do think he will run for a second term. I think he's given every indication of that. That being said, he's Donald Trump, and he holds his cards close to the vest. So
you worked with him. You worked with him. You're a better place to offer a view than many pundits are. That's for sure. Sean Spicer.